enabling environment for these media ecosystems to thrive. So as I said, one of the things that we try to do at CIMA is to promote dialogue, and one of our key objectives over the past few years has been to try to promote a dialogue between media development, that is as a concept and also as a field, with some of its adjacent fields, such as governance and development. We think today's discussion is going to be a really strong illustration of why this dialogue is so vitally important. On the topic today, specifically of civic engagement and media, we're looking at how civic engagement that may be conflictual, characterized by protest and antagonisms, can at times evolve towards dialogue and consensus, and hopefully towards resolutions that ultimately deepen democracy in law and in the minds of citizens. I realize that civic engagement today seems to be mostly going in the opposite direction, and that media has been and the challenges facing media systems are central, in fact, to the challenges that are pushing civic engagement away from dialogue and towards more greater conflict and greater antagonism. And that's why today's discussion really is so relevant, and why this dialogue between media development, between those thinking about media, those thinking about development, those thinking about governance, it's so vital for us to talk with one another. There is a lot of knowledge on this stage about what turns the tide from conflict to dialogue from many different perspectives. So I think that we will leave today, in spite of living in troubling times, with a sense of hope that we actually have a great deal of knowledge amongst us for addressing these really tremendous challenges. So with that, I'll introduce our illustrious panelists. Ivana Bajrović is the Associate Director for Europe here at the National Endowment for Democracy, and for more than a decade has been working to support citizen engagement and democratization in that region, so has real wealth of experience. Naomi Hussain, a research fellow and a former colleague of mine at the Institute of Development Studies, in the last decade has been looking particularly at the political and social responses to the food price spikes. Now, as many of you are aware, the reaction to the rising cost of food around the world has kindled in some places protests and riots, but in other places, has allowed citizens, civil society, governments, the private sector to come together to try to find solutions to this for the common good. So Naomi can speak from that perspective to what shifts the tide between antagonism and dialogue. We also have Tara Sussman-Pena, Senior Technical Advisor at IREX, who has been a really important figure in our field of media development for many years, and recently has been the lead author in a brand new strategy, which she'll talk about today, for IREX, which is one of the leading implementers of media development. And this new strategy is really looking to cross boundaries, to engage much more strongly with partners working on governance and development, and pushing their efforts downstream, if you will, not just towards objectives related to media, but towards objectives related to citizen engagement and development. So really timely contribution from IREX. And finally, we've got Marco Larizza, Senior Public Sector Specialist at the World Bank, and recently one of the authors of the World Bank, the World Development Report. Marco authored Chapter 8 and a spotlight on media that's associated with that chapter, looking precisely at citizen engagement. As many of you will know, this World Development Report has been received quite well, and as quite an ambitious, setting out quite an ambitious vision for governance, governance and law, and the law is the title. Marco has a copy there, and there are a few outside. IREX has also left a few copies of their report, so please pick up a copy of that on the way out. So to jump right into it, we're going to start with Marco. As I was saying, the World Development Report, which I've just learned this year's 2017, is the most popular, at least by measure of downloads. 90,000 downloads in just 4 months since it was released. So that's another indication of the appetite for this topic at the moment. And as I said, this flagship report is looking at, summarizes what we know about citizen engagement, and particularly Chapter 8 looks into the key channels that direct civic engagement towards positive and lasting change. So Marco, if you could start briefly giving us a little bit of context about what it is that we know about these channels, and particularly the role that media plays in this process.
Thank you. Is it working? Yeah. So it's a big pleasure to be here, and let's get straight into the issue so that we don't waste any time. Let me start by saying that with the World Development Report, for those of you that have been the opportunity to read it, or at least to be curious about it, we try to bring a contribution on what might be the opportunity to change situations where citizens don't have a voice, or the preferences might not be reflected in the way that policies are decided, designed and implemented. And there is an entire literature that we capture in the report that says that change is difficult, and so there is a reason why a lot of development outcomes are different about countries, and sometimes ineffective policies are persistent. But what we try to say is that there are actually ways in which change is possible, and this in a sense differentiate reports from other studies, which basically tells you have to wait for 200 years before your country develops or becomes Denmark. I mean, we're trying to say that even in the short term, countries can adapt, and citizens play a role in that, and there are different channels, and the channels, I mean, there is an entire chapter dedicated to that, indicate how citizens through their own organization can change incentives of decision making, reshapes preferences, and also reduce barriers of entry, which by that we means that how certain actors that were previously excluded can enter into the policy arena and basically have a say into the decisions that are made. Now, the media are all strongly connected to this process, because media can help citizens to organize. They can reduce information asymmetries, make information available, so they can help in all these 3 entry points: in changing incentives, in reshaping preferences, and reducing barriers of entries for actors or issues. They can bring to the table issues that were previously excluded. So then we can, I'm sure, say more on that and get into the ways through which media intervene into this processes through these different channels. And maybe we can just say that we also look at the fact that the media might also be a constraint to change. So there is some sort of an agnostic view of the role of the media that can be an agent of change, but by being captured by powerful interest and by being owned by certain groups might also undermine change. So this is something that we try to show in the report, and I'm happy to get into this as the conversation goes along.
Great. Do you want to say, you've brought one slide with you
yes.
on the framework. Do you want to say a couple?
Yeah, maybe, I mean, I don't know how many of you actually read the report or been exposed to it, so how much I should take for granted. But suppose this is the first time you hear about the World Development Report. There is one visual that basically try to say what is new about that and what is new about the way that we look at governance. Governance has usually been defined as systems of rules and procedures through which decisions are made and executed. We take a different view. We say that governance is a process through which state and non-state actors interact into a space which we call the policy arena, and in a system which is in a system of formal informal rules which is shaped and shapes power. What does it mean by that? Is that when people interact and to make decisions and to express their preferences, not everybody has equal power, and this power asymmetries determines what decisions are made and what preferences are then translated into the design of certain policies. So, but this visuals basically shows that the development outcomes can empower certain actors and give them the ability to shape the decision-making process in a way that can change the rules, and so also allow them to have a say in the formal processes that then determine who is in and who is out in the policy arena. So there's a lot of endogeneity. It's a circular process, but by that we want to say that understanding processes, understanding who is in and who is out, how certain actors are excluded or included, and how collective action can be organized in a way to help certain players to enter into the policy arena, that is important because affects development outcomes. So we have an instrumental view of governance, which is important not only in its own rights, but for the instrumental value that can have in making policies more effective and thereby have an effect in development outcomes. So this is probably the most important visual of the entire report.
Great. So governance, fundamentally important for development outcomes.
Yes, this is not new, but what we try to show in the report is how this linkages works historically. Great.
All right, that's a good segue to Tara, excuse me. As I said, IREX has unveiled this new strategy. Perhaps you could just say a few words to us about what this strategy is about, why it's such a tremendous shift for IREX, and particularly what it means for IREX to be using media development as a way of supporting these wider channels of governance and all of that implies for downstream for development in people's lives.
So, thank you, I should say, first for saying in your remarks. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm really excited, particularly with the kind of diverse group that we have here. I think that's great, and very needed moving forward. So, if you don't mind, I'll just give a bit of background as why do we do this, and why do we do this now? IREX has been around for almost 50 years, actually, and we've done our media work over the last 2 decades, and we had, in the mid-90s, kind of solidified what I'd call a holistic media sector approach to media development. So that was during a time when it was pretty easy to say, like, this is what the media sector is, right? We said that it had 4 important pillars: journalistic professionalism, legal rules and norms.
Can you check
Did
your...
I not turn on my...
Yeah.
Okay.
Were people catching that in the background? Sorry, I was listening and not paying attention to my cues over there.
Sorry, I was so excited, I just went running forward. So I'll just do a tiny backup. I won't back up to the beginning. What I was starting to say was that basically, why do we do this now? And we felt that with so much going on right now in the world in terms of just incredible technological transformation, with a lot of kind of, as you said, things going in the wrong direction in terms of economic and political norms, that this was a good time to take a look at our holistic media sector approach, which we developed in the mid-90s after the fall of the Soviet Union. And we had as a model a media sector, which had what we called 4 pillars. So journalistic professionalism, supporting institutions, legal and regulatory norms, and what am I missing? Business management. So, and the idea was that we would, through these 4 pillars, we would support media outlets, and the media outlets would produce good, useful content and give it to the audience. And sort of like there was a cycle that made sense. And it's not that this has completely gone away. Of course it hasn't, but as you know, I don't need to tell you, a lot has happened in the intervening 2 decades, right? So And IRX's reaction to these changes has mostly been to kind of take on new things or take away bits and pieces of our approach, but without really taking a step back and saying, are we still framing things in the right way? So as an example of new types of things, a lot of it related to new technology. So for example, integrated security, digital, physical, psychosocial security training that we do for journalists and now for activists as well has become a big part of what we do. It didn't really fit kind of exactly into this 4-pillar approach. So a lot of these kind of changes made us think that it was time to kind of step back and say, what's the right framing here? So I guess I wanted to emphasize again that this does not mean that we're leaving media behind. I've made this some version of a presentation about this to a group of media outlets that we work with, and I know that the first sentence there was like a sharp intake of breath. That does not mean that we think that professional media is dead or anything like it at all. We still believe that it's very important. We still support it. However, the system is much more complicated and has changed a lot. So we know that, for example, a lot of other actors are producing journalistic quality content in addition to just professional journalists. We know that there's a blurred lines between the audience and the media. And sort of all of these things, they continue to change, and we know that things are not going back to the mid-90s. So we figured it was time to start rethinking how we're doing everything. And we started with, so as I mentioned, IRX is a development organization that's been around for almost 50 years. We do media, but we also work in strengthening civil society institutions. We also work in strengthening education. We work with leadership. We work with youth. So it was also time to start to pull all these things together and kind of knowledge from across the other work that we've been doing. In the end, really, our focus is information, but it's because we value people, right? We prioritize people, and so it's information so that people can help drive their own development. And so that was where we, through a long process, came up with an idea and kind of a framework around what we call vibrant information. Yes, and so I guess I'll just talk now just about this piece at the end. So these are the two pieces that we do, and maybe I'll have a chance to talk about a bit later, but this is what we're calling vibrant information systems. So what do I mean by vibrant information? The first piece is content that matters, right? So we believe that fact-based information, informative information is a public good, and that we need political freedom, political skills in order to be able to create this content. Information should be inclusive of all types of people. It should be inclusive of many types of platforms, right, on a variety of topics. It should include opinion as well, but opinion marked as opinion, right? Not opinion marketed as something else. This means reporting on different levels, right? So the hyperlocal, the local, the national, the international, and another important piece about accountability, that it may be that civil society organizations are producing journalistic content, but they should be accountable to that content. All information actors should be. The next piece is a focus on multiple channels, right? So it's more about access to that information, right? We believe very strongly that information needs to flow freely, and that supports better development and governance outcomes. And the evidence, I think, is very much in the favor of that. So this means supporting institutions, media regulation, all of that should be supporting free flow of information. So when you look at the first two areas, I would say that's probably where IRX has focused on the most historically, at least in terms of how we talked about and thought about how we framed our work. But now we're also focusing on what we're calling dynamic engagement. This means thinking a lot more about what happens when people and information interact, right? So as we know from our own personal experiences, right, information, the way I'm thinking about it now is like information is not a shovel, that you give me a shovel, I try and dig a hole. It's a lot more complicated than that, right? I may believe or may not believe the information that you tell me, or perhaps it sort of helps me make some kind of meaning about my life, or helps me relate to a group or not relate to a group, right? There's a whole bunch of negotiations that people go through with information before they use it for something or don't use it for something, right? So we're making a commitment to try and understand that better. Even though we know we won't be able to understand it perfectly. And a big piece of that is people's ability to discern information. So be able to discern fact from fiction, be able to discern when they're having an emotional reaction to something that may be a manipulation. And it's the other piece I want to say about dynamic engagement is the piece about access, right? So it's one thing to have information there and be able to access it, but do people really understand, what it means, right? So do they really understand how to, just because I have a computer, do I understand how to use it? Do I understand what the security implications might be? So that whole world, really, of engagement. And the last piece is transformative action. And I think my own observation has been that in media development, we tend to say a lot that we believe that there should be good, useful journalistic content that provides people with important information that they need to make decisions important decisions for their lives. Some version of that I've heard many, many, many times over the year. And I think probably there was always like an underlying assumption that would lead to good action, that would lead to better development results. Perhaps there was like even, a little secret thought or a secret hope that would happen. But we never, at least IREX never put it out there as saying like, actually, no, we're really invested in this and we're really committed to this. This is really important to us. So part of our support is to that as well. And this could mean, it doesn't mean one thing necessarily, but of course we would focus on trying to bring about the positive types of actions, whether it's something like voting, or whether it's something like creating a new business or challenging anti-democratic power structures. It could be a huge range of things. But what is the action that comes at the end of the information? And then the last quick note I guess I'll say is just in terms of who we work with and how that's changing. I'm not sure that it's changing so much, but I think we're more sort of taking it on, that we're not just working with media institutions anymore. We work with consumers, information consumers. We work with, who are also creators, by the way. We work with libraries, actually, infomediaries, quite a bit. We work with civil society organizations that are producing information and that are trying to communicate better with their audiences. We work with think tanks. We work with sort of a whole range of actors. And so we really want to take that on as all being very important to this thing that we're calling vibrant information.
Great. Thanks a lot. So I'd like to turn to either Naomi or Ivana. Do you have any reaction to these presentations? Does this resonate with what you guys have seen on the ground? The World Bank putting governance in the media front and center in the World Development Report, IREX moving into its strategy into this many-to-many forms of communication and delving deeper into media's integration into the wider governance environment. These are all welcome changes, I presume, from your perspective?
Sure. I mean, I can start. And yes, absolutely welcome. They really resonated on both accounts. I think I'll start with the World Development Report that I have to be quite honest is often difficult to relate to from someone coming from a democracy assistance grant-making organization. And the little time that I had to read some of the parts of the report, and particularly those related to media and this media box, it was really like reading something completely unrelated to World Bank work, but related to what we do. And it was it's totally a compliment. Yes, absolutely. So it was really exciting to see that, and I can understand why this report is one of your most popular, if not the most popular. And then, of course, what Tara was just outlining really resonates with the work that Ned does here, although, of course, it looks like IREX has put a lot of thought into this, into analyzing this. And a lot of the language that is used is something that we encounter in our work and examples of which we encounter on daily basis, but maybe not think about it in the same way because we're not an implementer, but we are a grant-making institution. We oftentimes are associated with support for civil society first and foremost, just like IREX is first and foremost associated with media support. But in fact, it is actually a significant portion of the work that we do that is dedicated to media development. SEMA has done some excellent research in looking at these numbers and comparing our work in this field with some of the other grant-making organizations, and we do stand up there, I think, in the top 3 media assistance providers. And just to illustrate this with an example from the region that I've been covering for the last 12 years here, in 2016, for example, the small portfolio of discretionary grants in Southeast Europe that amounts to roughly 4.2 million had about 1.8 million in media assistance, which is roughly 40%. And this is just for grants that are directly related to media, the type of work that Tara has outlined, from supporting investigative reporting, direct media outlets, alternative media outlets. However, when you look at the rest of the portfolio and the civil society groups that are funded through this program, almost every single grant that we award has a media component that is there to assist in outreach and advocacy activities of the organizations that we fund. I do have to say, though, that what we've seen, at least from anecdotal evidence in the region that I cover, that the best results are produced when these elements come together. And I think I'll quote a couple of the phrases that were used here. When these things are pulled together to create action together, and when this civic engagement, when media helps civic engagement directed towards positive change. And I'd like to, if we have time, to give a really great example from Kosovo specifically, in something that our colleagues at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, a very dear and sister grant-making organization based out of New York, has dubbed the triangle approach, which is basically a synergy-building grant-making strategy that brings together three different actors in civil society. On one hand, a think tank, who's a think tank organization, whose role is usually to provide research, policy proposals, and recommendations. Then an advocacy grassroots organization whose role is to mobilize citizens and articulate their demands to the other members of this triangle. And then the third is, of course, a media organization that either provides deeper investigative reporting on a particular issue or helps to spread this message out, or both, depends. And this approach is something that I think that we often encounter in our work, but there are colleagues at RBF that have really trademarked this as a grant-making strategy, and something that allows for citizens to be engaged in this demand for accountability with really great input from the grassroots level, and an inclusive process that brings together these three different elements, in which each of the three organizations has their distinctive role. However, they inform each other's work, of course, and they build off of each other's work. And so, for example, one great example is three organizations in Kosovo in 2007 coming together in an attempt to try to better inform voters at the local level about what it is that their local government officials are doing or proposing to do, if we're talking about the pre-electoral period. So specifically here, the three organizations was a think tank fund, Institute for Advanced Studies, GAP, which was analyzing budgets of, in this particular case, ahead of local elections, of electoral candidates, for mayoral candidates for upcoming elections. The second one was a Forum for Civic Initiatives, Fitch, an advocacy organization that in this particular arrangement brought together local NGOs and mobilized citizens to come to what they dubbed town hall meetings with mayoral candidates. And the third one was a Kosovo branch of the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network, which then basically hosted these debates and moderated these debates with the mayoral candidates and questions with citizens. And it was the first time, really, in Kosovo and probably in the region as well, that citizens had the opportunity to really delve deep into what were the proposed platforms of these candidates, and what were these people, should they be elected, do with the monies that was at their disposal, which was really the citizens' money first and foremost. And this is as far as this initial attempt could have gone, of course. But 4 years later, come new elections, what they've done is they've created a benchmark for assessing the performance of these elected officials. And one of the immediate effects of this was that there was a 50% turnover in political parties in power, because citizens could finally hold the elected officials elected in the previous elections accountable, and either elect them or not elect them again to office. There are a couple of other concrete examples just in the lab, because we've also been funding various elements of this approach since 2007, and we still continue to fund them. And just in the last year, for example, some of the very specific development actually effects of this are that in 2 municipalities, there was one school that was being built and 2 there on which construction has begun. That was a promise made in previous elections, but without these mayoral debates and highlighting what some of these promises were, maybe wouldn't have happened, because citizens often don't make these demands on their own individual capacity. Or, for example, the fact that a mayor of another municipality fulfilled his electoral promise and closed all the casinos in his municipality, which tends to be a big problem in Southeast Europe. So, and the examples go on, basically. And cumulatively, what this has resulted in is one of the most popular television programs in Kosovo, certainly. It has entertainment value, too. I think I saw that sometimes these programs do have entertainment value in some countries in Latin America. For example, what is really exciting and interesting about this program is that as these mayoral debates are happening live, the moderator is actually able to live fact check what the mayoral candidates are saying, because the people from the two other organizations, particularly the think tank, are online with her, and as she's asking questions and receiving answers, she's able to immediately receive feedback from her colleagues and saying whether what they're saying is true and documentable or not. And so even though other television stations have tried to emulate this, it hasn't quite worked as well, because I think there's this synergy between these three organizations, each of which provides a specific value. And I think it's a really fantastic example of having different elements of civil society, including media, come together to push as a united force to create change, in this case at the local level.
That's terrific. I'd like to jump in, but I'm going to resist and ask Naomi to speak a little bit from your perspective, and particularly your experience, as I mentioned earlier, about the reaction around the world to the food price spikes and what that says about all this.
But I do want to take things in a slightly different direction.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to pick up on civil society, perhaps that's a good time to.
Well,
I want to talk about uncivil society as well. You see,
her example for me, it really brings back the World Bank something from the World Development Report, and that is in Chapter 8. It suggests that elections, political parties, citizen engagement, and participatory spaces spaces for dialogue, in and of themselves, are not very effective unless each of those is strong. So they strengthen each other. And I think once upon a time you might have thought of the media as another one of those citizen engagement pillars, but actually I think increasingly what the media is, and other knowledge brokers like think tanks, I'd maybe include them, are the glue, it's like the interstitial, it's what helps these channels for citizen engagement to work with each other. The media creates the knowledge that disseminates the knowledge that allows people to move between these spaces, frames the question in a way that allows these different institutions and channels to have that conversation. But so I was going to pose that as the media as the glue that binds these various channels. But why don't you jump in? Oh, all right. Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to, like others, I've also been very impressed by the more political turn that the World Bank has taken. Politics with a small p, let's say, recognition of power, a recognition of governance as a relationship between actors with different levels of power, rather than a kind of bland institutional arrangement. So this has really been great progress, and I particularly liked your work on citizen-driven change or citizen participation in change, because the organisation I work for, it's the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex. I should say, rarely get this opportunity to say, we are the top-ranking university in the world for development studies. We beat Harvard. I always have to say this in the US, otherwise nobody knows who we are. We beat Harvard again this year, and Oxford is somewhere down there, number 3, but we're the top. But one of the things we do very, very well at IDS is we've always done very citizen participation work on governance issues, on political issues, on development issues. It's really been a big theme for us for 50 or so years that we've been around. And I think we've been a thorn a little bit in the side of the World Bank World Development Report ever since the poverty report of, when was that, 2000, where they did the Voices of the Poor work, and we were pushing them from that time. So very much bottom-up approaches is very much what we are into. And I'm a member of a group called the Power and Popular Politics Cluster, and one of the things we're very interested in is this wave of informal politics, uncivil society, I think you could think of it as, unruly politics, that really started about 10 years ago. And it's one of these reasons I started looking at these issues of the what we called then the food, fuel, and financial crisis. I think in this country we think of it very much as the global financial crisis, but before that was a huge, really massive global crisis of fuel prices and food prices. And before any of the occupies and austerity protests in Europe and the US, you had this massive wave of food riots and fuel riots in something like almost 40 countries in the world. And this was a moment of great uncertainty and great unrest. There's no doubt about that, worldwide. 2007, 2008, 2009, the G20 were getting together. Everyone was very, very anxious. All the global elites were very, very anxious. And I think the reason Nick asked me to join this panel today is that we started doing some work thinking about what the effects of these protests were. And originally we started thinking about the media as a source of data for understanding what was going on. And as we continued with the work, we realized that the media were actually a very key actor in this process. And actually, only quite recently have I come to the conclusion that they played really quite a constructive role, which I don't think anyone has really picked up on yet. And I wanted to say a couple of words about that. And I think the international media played quite a different role to the national media in these cases. So we were studying what the international media was doing, talking about food riots, different kinds of protests, and how they were framing that, who was listening, and so on and so forth. And this is, very much what did you call it? The legacy media, the print media and the broadcast media. Not so much, we weren't really so interested in social media, which 10 years ago even, you talk about rapid change, 10 years ago, there were no WhatsApp groups or whatever they were now that we know protesters use. But in those days, those didn't exist. But the international media, when we looked at the coverage of that moment, it did three quite important things. First, it framed these food riots all around the world as a wave. So you got the sense of all of these things going on there were some in Somalia, there were some in Indonesia, there were some in Angola, wherever. But it was a wave. And so you got the sense that these things were not unconnected. There was a core, connection. And this is the international media coverage showed us this. The second thing they did was they framed it very much as a dangerous issue, a matter of great danger. And this was in the news headlines of the time, and it's the threat of the global crisis. It was a really dangerous situation where not only quite a few governments were toppled at this time, and I should say a lot of people have connected those protests to what subsequently happened in the Middle East, the Arab uprisings. Some people called it the Arab Spring. There was a connection. I wouldn't say it was a causal connection, but it was a trigger. There's no doubt, those food price issues. So it was a very dangerous time. The third thing was it was a real kind of commentary on the failure of the global economy, if you like. So the international media did these three things and said essentially to the global policy and political elite, the IMFs and the World Banks and the UNs and the G20s, you got to do something. And it really sent this message. The national media did quite a different job, actually, and looked much more closely at how protesters in Mozambique or wherever they were, why they were not only angry about not being able to afford to get the bus to work anymore, but also how they were connecting that to corruption and to political issues that authoritarianism, also to inequality. And they kind of really put pressure on governments to act. And both the global policy domain really shifted around the food issue in particular, but so did a lot of national policy agendas moved on this. So your point about what happens when in the policy arena, Marco, very much the media played a role in helping set these agendas. And kind of three things really struck me about the role that the media played here, and this very much picks up on what you're saying, Tara, about the way in which the media has changed. And one is that rather than sitting there reflecting the reality of what was going out in the world, the international and national media played quite kind of formative roles in the politics of this time. And one thing was that they were it was quite analytical. They would say, well, it's this kind of protest, not that kind of protest. They would kind of determine, they would categorize and classify and really do analysis, the kind of thing that researchers should have been doing, but researchers can't be there in time. It's 20 years later and we'll get our journal articles out. But it really is, in my case, that is the case. 10 years later, I'm finally getting the book out on the food riot. But, the media is there on the spot, telling the story and analysing. So an analytical role is very much there. This is getting more and more important in a more globalised, more complex world. Who can understand things? Well, who's going to understand big global shifts like this? Well, you need journalists who are going to be able to make this kind of, to look at these complex patterns and figure out, tell a story, tell a narrative that connects them all. So they did that. Another thing they did, which I think is very important, is they amplified the voices of people who had no voice. So in Mozambique, this was very striking. We looked at what was happening there with the protesters. And there were all these civil society groups, very polite, very nice, sat around in nice hotel rooms with the donors and so on, and had no idea what was going on the street. So what the media did was actually amplify the voice of the street in a way that civil society was entirely failing to do in Mozambique. And the other thing they did was, and this is very noticeable in India, in the right to food movement in India, they played a very activist role, not only in India, in other countries as well. They were acting like activists, getting involved with activists, again, very connected with what you're saying. Really supporting organizations, working with them, really setting a kind of a moral agenda, really, about what this was, a kind of a rights-based, I would say, agenda about what citizens' rights were and how governments should respond. So in this way, I think there's a kind of an uncivil, a kind of unruly aspect to the way in which the media works in development, which is quite powerful, which is not really captured by rules and formal arenas. It's about people struggling to get in. And because they're newsworthy and because they capture something maybe in the popular imagination, the media works very well with those sorts of struggles at times. It's an interesting and challenging agenda, I think. And I think we see more of this now. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Fabulous. Did anybody want to jump in? I have another question, but let's have a bit of conversation around this. Yeah, please.
Yeah, so I play the advocate, like the bank used to do. So I mean, this conversation is really exciting, and you're all pointing at the precisely the entry points that we're trying to emphasize in the reports, how media really bring new issues to the tables. They give information, so they change voting behavior, and so in a sense, reducing information asymmetries, they change the incentives of elites, and people informed behave differently. They also help people to coordinate. You mentioned the idea, how the protest, and so there is a lot about the positive role in the media spotlight, and throughout the report, we emphasize the fact that the media are themselves part of the political process that underlies development. So the people in power, I mean, what we call the elites in the report, we have the main actors defined as elites or citizens, and we define elites, those have direct influence over the policy decision-making process. Elites are not stupid, so in a sense, if you look at around the world, billionaires tend to be involved in media. And powerful actors trying to control media, and they do that for a reason. And government try to control media. And there is an interesting research that shows that government ownership of the media affects the way that certain issues are or not broadcast. So in a sense, media can indeed be an actor, but they don't develop in a vacuum. They develop themselves into a political market. If you understand the political market, you also understand sometimes the dark side that the media can play. We show, for example, in the report that there's an interesting paper in the case of Argentina that shows that corruption scandals tend to be advertised by journals and media which were not owned or not associated with the government. And this is not surprising, but it was a very rigorous research that shows that. And equally, we featured the famous case of Montesinos, the bloody videos in Peru. In Peru, for 10 years, the media was the machine of the Fujimori regime. It was the instrument through which the consensus was built. And how that instrument was working through bribery. So, and there's an interesting data here. And if bribing a politician or a judge was costing $10,000 a month, bribing a media channel was costing $1.5 million a month. So almost like 100 times higher. So that shows you like what is the role of the media and how important they are for the powerful elites, and why everybody try to get control over them. And in fact, the reason why eventually the regime collapsed, there are many reasons, but the media actually played a role, because there was one television channel which could not be bribed, and that was the channel that eventually broadcasted the video showing the Montesinos bribing every single politician, and then the moral outrage allowed the oppositions to coordinate and basically bring Fujimori down. So there is a lot of things we should think about, and what we tend not to consider is the fact that the media market is endogenous to the political process. So thinking about how the media competition can be increased is should be the focus of the conversation among the
I
donors.
just wanna
Say that
add-
again. The media market is endogenous. What
So
you
in a
say
sense, the
is-
media market, how media functions, is themselves like a function of that process
Yes.
that happened in the policy arena, right? So
I think
who have more interest, who have more power to make sure that certain interests are reflected, and certain messages are or not accessible by the citizens. So in a sense, they control not only who gets information, but also the information that you get.
Let me put it, I think, this is, SEMA has been thinking about power in the media quite a bit. I mean, media is an actor. It wields its own power in some respects. It is a avenue of power for others, but it is also, I think, a site of struggle. And that's why we talk about the governance being, the governance of the media system as being so important, is that when there is a struggle for control, if you will, of the media, intervening at that site is actually crucially important for ensuring that other sectors of governance are protected and strengthened. It's not just a microcosm. It's, because it is interstitial, it's a microcosm with tentacles that, reach out into other areas. And it seems, we've really been trying to push this idea that, rather than just thinking of media as a capacity that you build, thinking of it as a site of governance itself. And that governance is not determined only by the laws and regulations. No, not at all. It's determined by the capacity of civil society to understand and to protect that space, champions inside of government, working with the media to basically defend the value and the principles of this kind of keeping this space open for democratic dialogue and deliberation. So, we really think that is very strategic space. Did you? Yeah.
Something to say.
I can just also underscore that point, both points that Marco and Naomi were making. And just to go into a slightly different direction, I think that social movements, people who are protesting, people who are mobilized civically, should really take a note of some of the things that are being said here, and particularly in a sense of the important role that media is playing. And although I have not studied this extensively and am about to write a book on protests, there have been quite a few protests in the region that I cover starting in 2014. And I hate to say this, but unfortunately a lot of them have failed, I think precisely because of this lack of recognition that these different elements play in what you were just describing, Nick, and media in particular. And just to give you an illustrative example of a massive wave of protests in Bosnia in February of 2014, which were the most violent and most massive protests the country has seen in the post-war period, and basically started when a group of workers in the northeastern region who were disenfranchised by botched privatizations clashed with police, and then that sparked a nationwide wave of protests that was then joined by the veterans and the pensioners and the students and who not, and ended up in something, a new type, for at least for the region, a new type of engagement, which were called the plenums, which used a lot of elements of the Occupy Wall Street movement. However, the crucial mistake, in my opinion, that the plenums made at the very beginning was to exclude elements of formal civil society, advocacy and think tank organizations, media, because they didn't feel comfortable, again, because they were afraid of the politicization, the media were maybe too much of a power channel rather than an agent of change. And even political actors who, as you were just describing, I think you were saying, friendly faces in the governments and in political institutions, which are ultimately necessary for political change. And when the demands of these so-called plenums came out, they were very difficult to implement in practice, because first they were ill-informed by what the real policy-making process is and looks like. Oftentimes they were completely outside of the jurisdictions of what the governments can do and the time frame within which they can do them. And most importantly, they didn't really have a proper channel in, first and foremost, legacy media, which continues to be the most preferred channel in this region, even though the internet penetration is quite high, to convey these messages to, of course, not just the other citizens, but those who are ultimately making the decisions. And I think a lot of the things that Naomi was saying are very important for social movements as such to take in and note that all of these different parts really have a role to play.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make a really quick kind of,
Please.
I don't know if it's a meta comment, but it's sort of a comment on the commentary, which was just to ask that we think really critically about how we're using the term media and what do we mean by that, sort of in the wake of the last 20 years and what we know. Like, yes, there is still legacy media, and in very rare situations, is it still acting exactly like it was 20 years ago, right? So, and I think if we're trying to think, and it's not like everyone, of course, has to use our model, but I would just encourage you to sort of broaden your thinking about what do you mean by media, and think about the broader information system. What are the think tanks doing, or what are the civil society? What is the information they're producing that might be influencing it? And it's not this isolated thing anymore. So I'm just conscious that with our speech, we're kind of repeating again what we've sort of moved away from. And I think it's maybe just a word in this uncomfortable moment where we're in a moment of transition, and who knows what we'll end up being.
Yeah. I'd like to, this has been really fascinating. I'd like to, with a bit of the time we have left, move a little bit towards implementing some of these really, these great visions and ambitions for bringing people together, and media, serving as this, as the glue, or as the links between these different forms of citizen engagement. But I might, Tara, can I start with you? And I know this is early stages, but what is going forward? What does this look like on the ground for IREX? Yeah.
Can we go back to our
Absolutely,
snapshot slide?
Oops, there it is.
So the kind of thinking and implementation piece for IREX is the increasing opportunities, which means kind of legal and cultural freedoms, and improving abilities, which would be skills and talent. So these sort of two big categories. So that's what we're planning to do in order to get to this. And a lot of it we do already. Some of it perhaps not quite so well articulated to ourselves, or perhaps not quite so well thought intentionally ahead of time or integrated with the rest of our work. I can call out perhaps, there's actually several new elements here. Maybe I'll call out a few of them just to say, what are some of the things that we're thinking about that we think will make a difference towards creating vibrant information. The first one I'll mention is leverage power dynamics, and this actually dovetails very well with what you were saying about understanding unequal systems of power. Like, we know that pretty much any system we're going to be dealing with, that we'll be implementing in, intervening in, will be facing great inequalities of power. So this is a commitment to take that on more consciously, and to understand the actors and try to understand different types of incentives and how we might leverage incentives, so that champions that might support vibrant information will be more supported, or the potential spoilers might perhaps be diffused a bit. And that would be through things like political economy analysis, through gender analysis, through sort of an upfront and also ongoing analysis of power. Another piece I'll emphasize is the strengthening relationships piece of things. Now this is something I would say IREX is actually really good at, and has been really good at from our inception. We started out as an higher education exchange program, so really building relationships between US institutions and then Soviet Union institutions. And I think we're still very good at it, but we almost took it for granted, I would say. So what I mean by this is really building trust across groups and across individuals that perhaps were even antagonistic beforehand, really doing the best to try and get people to see commonalities and work together. And we believe that this and a lot of the kind of sort of softer skills are actually absolutely critical ingredients to having any of the technical stuff work. So in sort of blunter terms, like, who cares if you train 1 million journalists if you don't do any of this softer stuff, because it does not, from our experience, it doesn't work. So it's a commitment to that piece of things. And then the last one I'll talk about now is this idea of performance. Now in this category, I actually would put a lot of the things in there that you would traditionally associate with an IREX or another media development implementing organization. That is to say, training journalists, working on digital skills and digital tools, helping media outlets to get better at business, whether they're for-profit or non-profit. There's a whole long list of these kinds of things. But we've reframed it to think about performance as opposed to capacity building. And the idea there is, I think with the way that capacity is framed a lot of times, it doesn't necessarily have an end, right? Capacity for what? And at IRX, we've put together a performance improvement guide for ourselves internally, but we're taking it on as well in the information and media practice, so that when we're doing all of these kind of skill and technical building things, it's with the idea that they will have outcomes and there will be impact and it can be measured. So it's an idea of overall performance. So these are some of the things that we're doing, and maybe just one quick mention about sort of the way in which we're doing, or some of the core principles, which would be some of the soft skills like listening, right? The first thing that we do when we go anywhere is first we listen. We ask people to tell us what their issues are, and we try and understand. And this is an ongoing process. So a lot of I do implementation and work as well, and a lot of what I hear are from our folks on the ground is how they're adapting and changing to ongoing circumstances. And sometimes it doesn't look that pretty, but it's the reality that seems to work better. It's also a bigger commitment to knowledge gathering and sharing. So it's not just to do research, but to do research that's really relevant to our work, and we hope to others, and to figure out really how to make a better connection between what we're learning and what we're doing to more productive ends. And the last piece is using a gender lens. So we're very committed to inclusion, and we've particularly committed to incorporating looking at gender inequalities across all of our work.
Great. I know Marco has had something. Is it on this topic, or can it wait for a minute? Did you?
I can wait.
Great.
Yes.
So, sticking on the topic of how we implement this vision of these, building these networks and helping media to support this the citizen engagement across silos. Ivana, can you mandate that these, as a donor, from a donor's perspective, can you mandate that this stuff happens, or is there a strategic way of catalyzing this kind of work?
Definitely, the answer to the first question is no. One should not mandate these things. And of course, my view is slightly different from Tara's, because we're simply a donor and grant-making organization, not an implementer. So I will speak from that perspective alone. But a lot of the things that she says, I think, are evident also in the way we approach some of these building of these networks or coalitions, if you will. So one way of doing that is to identify the groups that share a common vision and help them see that commonality. I think you used this phrase, Tara, of seeing their commonalities and building trust with each other. And the role of a donor, in my opinion, and I think that this is a philosophy that NED espouses throughout, is more of a convener. So facilitating these opportunities for these different actors to get to know each other and to recognize the values that each of them can bring to the process, but definitely not force these partnerships and coalitions. I have to say that in the 12 years that I've been here in the region I cover, I've seen too many calls for proposals that condition grant making on the building of networks and coalitions or consortiums or what you will. And I do think that those things have to develop organically. They require time to develop organically, far more time than one has to develop a proposal for a donor. And then what you often end up with is that once these coalitions and partnerships are created, as the organizations start to get to know each other and things don't work out, a donor should, if possible, have flexibility to make adjustments, which is not often the case if the whole premise of the assistance was to build a firm coalition and a partnership at the very beginning. And so I think that this is this approach in which this will be these partnerships themselves, in addition to the types of things and the approaches that the individual actors will be working on, have to be driven organically and locally. Here, an important point is that this ownership should remain with the groups throughout. And I know that not all donors can afford this, but for example, one very simple way, and one that I've seen quite a bit, the element that interferes with this is the branding strategies. And this need for donors to promote themselves and their work, rather than allowing the people that were meant to assist to retain the ownership of what they're doing. And I think that to the extent that it's possible, I always appeal to my colleagues in the donor world to try to remove their brands and logos from these programs that they're supporting, unless they're actually implementing them themselves, because this really interferes with this ownership idea. And then finally, long-term support. I was mentioning that this triangle approach that both the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and NED has been working on since 2007. And so we're talking 10th year now. And some of the results have been produced even earlier, but I think for real change, and I think everybody recognizes it, maybe not 200 years, as Marco was saying, but certainly a decade or more is necessary in terms of this, in terms of seeing real change, and that would be, I think, probably the last point I would make.
Do you want to jump in, Marco? Please, yeah.
Yes, something very quickly on on this organic versus induced participation, which is indeed a terminology we use in the report, and I agree entirely. I mean, summarizing the literature on the topic, we made the case in the last chapter, which is about international actors and processes, that change cannot be engineered from outside. So, I mean, this is, even if we make the case that building coalitions between citizens and different sectors of societies and decision maker is historically a key ingredient for successful change, you cannot engineer this from outside. So that's very well taken. That speaks about the case of you mentioned, Ivana, the Arab Springs, right, and different outcomes that they can bring. If you look at the media, that role that they was playing in the Arab Spring, then of course you can help coordinating protests, and then so you can help spikes those protests. But then it's by no accident that in Tunisia has been one of the most successful cases so far. And why is that? Because media was an actor and it was an ingredient of something else. They did not substitute collective action, but they were helping collective action. So what they had in Tunisia was the ability of workers' organizations, social grassroots organization, which was historically strong, and women organizations, and they were using media as an instrument, but they had collective actions themselves. So I guess the point is how this collective action can be promoted and sustained in the long term, and where collective action comes from. That should be the focus, because of course this cannot be engineered and quick fix, but the extent to which media can or cannot facilitate change is a factor of how well or effectively citizens can organize. And I have a point on that, but maybe
go ahead.
Can I? Maybe one thing that because indeed, if we look at the development community, there are some striking statistics. Only, I think, 0.3% of the entire development assistance that the OECD countries gives to developing countries goes to media support. So, I mean, there is definitely space for improvement. Everybody will, probably agree with that. The point is how that could be made, and how that can be made in a way that does not reinforce existing power structures, existing power dynamics. One thing that we show, and that goes again to the idea that is a decade-long process, and sometimes it even takes more than decades. We show the case of an interesting starting in the case of US. In the 19th century's US, most of the media were owned by local powerful elites, right, in each of the states, and in a sense, that basically facilitated corruption, because there was a capture of the way that media were advertising certain information. The study shows that, looking at about 100 years of history, what facilitated the development of independent media was the rise in the prices of the advertising revenues. So, in a sense, if advertising revenues becomes more valuable for the media owners, so in a sense, if it's more expensive, also you get more money, you get access to different revenues, and you can be more independent from government sources. So that tells a lot about the role that the private sector development can play. So by developing private sector, you can facilitate actors that can contribute to buying media spaces, and by buying media spaces and broadcasting opportunities, they can provide these different revenues. So again, it's an indirect process, takes decades, but it helps us to change some power dynamics by supporting different actors.
Unfortunately, I think that model of ad revenue-based journalism is failing obviously now. And one of the things that we're seeing is that this opens the opportunity for oligarchs, for elites connected to politicians to control media, not through the old-fashioned ways of control and censorship, but by twisting the screws of what revenue is left, by taking ownership of media outlets, something in Eastern Europe that has been seen actually quite widely, and often through less than transparent means. So it's, it seems like it's some Austrian holding company buying up Hungary's leading newspaper, and no one really knows who it is that's behind it. So the market has not been the bulwark against, for independence that it used to be, unfortunately, and that really has added a wrinkle to, I think, our recipes for media development these days. But you guys don't have any questions or anything, right? All right. So I have a question for you, Naomi, but let's take a few questions from the audience, and then we'll come back. Yeah. We have a woman in the back row, this gentleman in the red tie, and one of our fellows here in the middle. Go ahead.
Thank you. I work in journalism for 10 years, and then I work with a nonprofit here in DC focused on integrity and governance. So I have very clear the two hats, and I'm actually starting a PhD now focused on how they are crossing, right? The aspect of the transformative action that the IRX colleague mentioned, I think is something that is incredibly important. And I was wondering, for all four panelists, to what extent do you feel that in this new context, the evaluation and the indicators that have been used to assess, effectiveness of the investment of, the results of media, professional journalism versus this professional quality information that is coming out from NGOs and others, to what extent do you feel that you have the right evaluation models to determine that? I don't want to be dismissive of what is there, but at the same time, I think they're very, very limited. When you see evaluations that focus on the number of publications that were made, or what kind of results happen, even if they're just random. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Tara will be very, very happy to answer that question. All right, this gentleman here. Yeah.
I wanted to pick up on your last comment about the economics. I think you have to differentiate between, what might be happening in Eastern Europe is quite different than in less developed places. And you find in Africa, the media sector can be squeezed by government as the major advertiser and can decide not to cough up that revenue. But it doesn't mean that therefore you turn away from the economic fundamentals of the sector. Rather, you have to get right the commercial side, because that's often the only thing that really is sustaining the media, is the ability to sell advertising to various companies, and that has to be an essential component of whatever the programming is. Now, having said that, I work at USAID. I'm not speaking on their behalf, but having been a journalist and a media trainer for a long time, I don't think the aid agencies themselves are capable of stipulating the degree of attention that's necessary to the economic fundamentals of the business, because you won't get a decent, substantive story if the editor feels we're barely surviving and it's obligatory that you go off and cover this press conference. And the composition of the news is a whole series of coverage of press conferences. So such and such important person said this yesterday. That's the basic structure of things. And implied in there, which rarely gets picked at, is a kind of status hierarchy about who's entitled to have something to say in society. And what the media disturbs leaders so much is because it is somewhat not accepting the notion that you as president get to say everything. And if anything, the form of training and encouragement is how do you get the media to cultivate a regular, for example, a column by the head of the Union Federation commenting about economic policy. That rarely happens, and because there's a norm in the heads of the editors and a lot of other things, that's just not how you do things. But if you want to figure out how to translate words on a page into civic activism that gets some traction, you got to figure out a way to get away from a sort of unipolar status hierarchy in a country and get toward a place where there's a whole lot of voices that's the norm speaking. So you get the Catholic bishop to write something, you get the unions, you get the summit. So that once that becomes the norm, you have more opportunities for cooperation between those players. It's very difficult for a donor ever to have the insight because we're on our own little treadmill and trying to close the loop and get our stuff out the door and everything. But to the point about how do you demonstrate effectiveness, you have to bring those points into the offering. And once you do so and you point to it on the back end and say, we did this and here's why it worked, then you're more likely to get more business going forward, I think.
Great. We had one more question, and then we'll, yeah.
Hi, thank you. Johnson Yuan, a fellow at National Endowment for Democracy. I would like to share a bit of the experience of Hong Kong. So when we organized the Umbrella Movement back to 2014 and combined what we observed after some of the survey, we found there were three phenomena during the movement. The first one was there were over half of the protesters who are newcomers to social movement and political actions, which means they are not tapping into any information float or not very clear of the narrative or discourse or framing of media before the contentions. The second phenomenon is there were decentralized information float. 65% of them are constantly sharing news from media outlets, but at the same time 35% of them are repeatedly generating content on their own, which means they take photos of the protests, they take videos, they express their opinions. And the third phenomenon is there is a increasingly decentralized momentum within the movement. And a lot of the people, they shape their political opinion or perception of the movement through their friends, through their social circle, but not media outlet. And all these phenomena cause one consequences, which is similar to Bosnia, which is there are increasing mistrust between individuals, protesters, and organizations. And the reason for that is very obvious because there were newcomers. There isn't a overwhelming dominant framing in the movement. So what I would like to know is this some phenomenon that you also observe in your research? And what are the role of media outlet or traditional institution like think tank or other information broker in those contention? And what are the way and strategy to divert this synergy generated during the movement into a more positive way of dialogue within the movement and to improve the chances of people who are being politicalized to a more institutional politics? Thank you.
I think Yvonne and Naomi, you might want to answer that. I think you both have some responses to that last question. Tara, do you want to start with the first question, though, about the indices we have? Are they good enough?
Maybe the second question, I think they're
sure.
the comment about how do we know how well we've done. And I think you've hit on something that really bedevils our small sector, and there's several levels at which to think about the question too, right? So is one of it is evaluation of individual projects, and there's certain ways that we're required to evaluate by donors, and then other ways that we use to evaluate in order to sort of feed in and help adapt. Some of those are better than others. You know, some of them are sort of the basics of, did the training actually happen? How many people were there at the training? You know, these kinds of things. There's we do, when we're working with content producers, we do have measures of content according to journalistic standards, so we can use those. We have a tool we call the MCAT. Other organizations have other tools. So we try to measure content, but that we even have internal debates about what do we mean by quality content and how do we measure it, and if we haven't used this tool, can we still think about that? If you try and look at sort of broader level impacts, you can try and look at things like laws changed, passed, or implemented. That's also tricky, because how do you draw a line between what the implementer's done and what you've come out on the end? On a more meta level, or more, I should say country level, IREX produces something called the Media Sustainability Index, which are Leon Morse, my colleague here, is the longtime managing editor of it. And the way that works is to really, it is used sometimes to evaluate individual projects, but in any case, it's a long-term look at 22 countries in Europe and Eurasia, and at times, depending on funding, other countries as well. So that's an attempt to, it still uses actually those 4 pillars that I talked about at the beginning, like how we used to see the media sector, to see how is the media sector of a country performing according to these broad categories of journalistic professionalism and so forth. Now that we've kind of redone our approach and we're looking at vibrant information from a different perspective, we're also looking at the Media Sustainability Index, which may end up being called something else, to kind of realign it with these kinds of things. But in terms of the work we've been doing on that and the feedback we've been getting from people, it's very much what you've been saying, like how can you, where do you have the data, where's the evidence to be able to answer these kinds of questions? So it's very much that's like very much part of the daily struggle, I would say. And I guess one more piece is that we're also beginning to invest a bit more in our impact as an organization, if we can't do it countrywide, but as an organization, how are we meeting certain indicators related to information and media? So we're collecting data across projects. And we're also looking at doing impact studies, which it's pretty rare. I think it's pretty rare in governance generally, but even rarer in media and information development. So going back and looking after a project has closed and saying, you know, what can we say about whether or not it's made an impact? And in the classical case, it would be you'd have the control group and the experimental group and doing a comparison. We're also looking at some other kind of different ways of experimenting with that, but I'd say it's a long, ongoing dialogue. You've hit upon a real challenging question there.
Yeah.
Yeah, Marco, did you?
You want to say something first?
I won't take either of the first two.
Okay. Why don't you? Were you going to answer the first question or the second question?
Both or less.
Go ahead.
Both of them, but I'll leave you to answer first, or you want me to go first?
Why don't you answer the second
okay.
question first?
Okay,
and then we'll
maybe.
go to the third
Well,
question
no,
for
I
you.
was struck by the point that USAID gentleman made about the fact that, of course, we cannot engineer the economic foundations of the business, and indeed the study that we feature, look at 100 years. So it's a long-term process to generate independent media. But if I can, leave us with a bit more hope, and maybe referring, I don't know if you have that graph available, that visuals about again how we can be a bit more creative as a donors and linking the dots that we usually don't, and using the media for a bit more than what we usually think about them. And we have this. There's another spotlight in the WDR that looks about transparency and under what conditions transparency and accountability initiative do have an impact for development. There's a lot of debate on that. I mean, most of the times donors, we actually focus on making information available. So you make everything transparent and you just assume that somebody else will do the rest of the job. And we make the point that by making information by publicity itself, so make information accessible to people, and this is where the media is important, is a key ingredient for accountability. So it's not just to make them available, but ensuring that there is an actor that can use that information. And I'm saying this because most of the times, for example, we help countries to strengthen transparency, and we help, for example, accountability institutions like the national audit offices, and they publish reports, and sometimes they are credible sources of information precisely because they receive a lot of technical assistance also from outside players. And we don't do the extra steps of thinking what other players can be brought into the dialogue once these reports are out. And there are cases, like quite successful cases of countries where government themselves were quite creative in this sense. We have the case of Brazil, for example, that actually used the media to systematically, and so as part of their anti-corruption program in Brazil a few years back, the central government wanted to monitor municipal government. So National Auditor Office was auditing these municipalities, and then as part of the anti-corruption program, they were given subsidies so that local media, so we are talking about small radios in rural areas and local newspapers, where they actually were available, could publicize the content of these audits. And by making this information available, the result was that there was, as in the case of Kosovo, huge turnout, and the corrupt mayor was actually voted out. So the point is that by bringing at media, and sometimes is radio, and there's a lot of examples in Africa looking at the role that radios in rural areas actually played in reducing these information asymmetries and making sure that transparency works. What is difficult is, again, when you speak about media, to understand that they can either reshape preferences, so they can help people thinking in a new way about the same things, or helping bring in new issues on the tables, or they can also simply amplify existing preferences and maybe magnify the polarization that exists in a country. So again, you need to bring them as an actor, but also the role that they play depends again on whether or not they can be an actor of the politics or maybe reshape the political games. And we have in fact another report in the World Bank, just released before the World Bank development report. I should give a bit of recognitions here, which is produced by the DEC last year, and is called Making Politics Works for Development, with big P in this case, and is all about under what condition transparency can change voting behavior. And there's an entire chapter dedicated to the fact that media can actually be an actor either by increasing polarization, so just simply amplifying the preferences that people have, or being an instrument of public deliberation, so having a more long-term process through which people start thinking differently about things. And this is the role of educational entertainment that you were referring to. So again, they have a role to play, but media are not all the same, and they have a different effect.
Great. Naomi and Ivana, that third question seems to go to the heart of our issues here. Movements emerge. How do we, create synergies that make them impactful and lasting? I believe that's the essence of it.
Yes, I thought it's a very interesting question. The umbrella movement really did feel like it sprung out of nowhere, and these people hadn't had much experience of politics before.
It wasn't out of nowhere. I think he helped lead it, actually.
Oh, I must talk to you afterwards then. No, it was such a very interesting phenomenon. But it struck me a bit when you were talking about the suspicion, the hostility to the mainstream media. I hate this phrase. We hear this all the time. The mainstream media. And it was also true of many of the occupiers around the world. I think people here maybe think it was only in New York, but there were many occupiers all around the world. And many of them were very hostile to the mainstream media. And this also goes to your point about the polarization in the media of the tendency to give some important man a platform and to ignore all the many other voices. Of course, it creates a sense in which this is not a space in which our voices can be heard. How can we trust this organization? But this issue of the suspicion of the mainstream media, I think, is coming back in. I don't know how widely people are recognizing this, but I keep coming across this in my social life and my social media. The extent to which people I think are perfectly normal and mentally healthy are deeply embedded in extreme conspiracy theory thinking, which they believe comes from something called the mainstream media. These are intelligent people with master's degrees from perfectly good schools. So I really worry about the suspicion of the media, and where it comes from is to me completely alien. I don't understand it. But also as a teacher of postgraduate students, I'm also very aware that people don't really have a kind of a critical filter that I think that we were taught when I was young, 100 years ago. But people, one source of information seems to be much as good as another source of information. I don't understand where that's coming from. And so I think the suspicion of the media is a problematic function of some kind of loss of sense of authority, legitimacy, loss of trust in formal institutions. But nonetheless, I think there's something very important about these experiences of mobilizing these social movements, the umbrella movement being one. They may have been new and they may have just been experiencing political activism for the first time, but those apprenticeships, that you never lose those experiences. They tell you a lot about what is possible, how to organize, and the next time they're struggling for democracy, they'll do it smarter, is my sense.
Ivana, did you want to speak to that?
To that, and then briefly to the first question, I do think that this lack of trust that Naomi was talking about, and that you mentioned as well, extends beyond just media, but also to organized civil society. And I actually have done some research on this, which ended up in a short book called Mistakes Donors Make. I do think that we're largely at fault as donors, because the approaches that we've employed, particularly early on in developing civil society, have led to really separating civil society from who their true constituencies, which are ultimately citizens. And you see this, I think, most vividly when it comes to the social movements. I've certainly seen it in the last 3 years in the Balkans. And rebuilding that trust is one of the key components. And it also actually comes with a little bit of distrust towards donors and the donor work in a particular country. And I've often been asked by people who were involved in social movements, how can you as a donor support the social movement? And I'll tell you right away, direct support is very difficult to do because there are accountability issues. And as a donor, we're often constrained to working with formally organized civil society groups or media groups. But one way in which we could support as social movements is what I was saying earlier, is that acting as a convener and a bridge builder and maybe a trust builder too between social movements that do, most likely, as Naomi was saying, lack experience in organizing, in policy making, in media outreach, with those who have it. And those often are the civil society groups. And of course, not all civil society groups are created equal. But if you can help to kind of sift through this very diverse field of civil society and media and think tanks and even political actors, and help to find design these partnerships and help the social movement, and that might be one way of approaching it. And of course, I'm theorizing here because if I had the answer, then every social movement would be very successful. But I think that from what I've seen in the region that I cover, this has really been what's lacking. And very briefly on measuring impact or evaluating impact, it's a constant struggle, absolutely, here at NED as well. But I think for a very long time, and certainly for the last 12 years that I've been here, because our excellent management, monitoring and evaluation manager here at NED came at the same time as I did here, we've always really focused not on outcome, not on outputs, but on outcomes and impacts, recognizing that this is a harder approach to evaluation. So while we still continue to use a lot of quantitative indicators to look at what impact whether media or civil society projects have had, we understand the limitations of those, and then we really want to see what change actually happened. And that's really difficult, of course. First of all, there are not that many changes that happen within a year grant period, which is what our grant period usually is. But also having one concrete story is better than having some general claims about changing a particular environment. So we often resort to anecdotal evidence in telling stories like I did at the beginning of this, the triangle approach, in basically how many mayors in this, out of 38 municipalities in Kosovo, have basically implemented very specific policies in the mandate that they were awarded of 4 years. They were direct result of being put on a spot by their citizens in a town hall meeting.
Yeah. Go ahead. I mean, we'll take another quick round of questions. Yeah.
I mean, very quickly on that. And if NED is constrained and engaging with civil society, you can imagine the constraints of the World Bank. So in a sense, as a donors, we've been criticized for a long time for the fact that you basically engage with executives and then with the people, with the government. But at the same time, as an effect of this dialogue with civil society, I think we've come a long way from these traditional approaches. And we have instruments nowadays that actually been established since quite a few years now, like the Global Partnership for Social Accountability, which is a platform through which money, grants are given to civil society organizations to develop interventions that are, they have a relevance for development outcomes that involve state and non-state actors. So the bank, in this case, plays like an honest broker role, but there is also funding mechanisms through which civil societies can implement initiatives. And what we've been trying to do as a part of the operationalization of the WDR, to say what does it mean now for our work, is to see if the design of these grants can be informed by some of the messages in a way that when you give grants to these civil societies, you might make sure that the kind of initiatives take stock of the evidence from the literature. So, for example, bringing media in the way that they engage in the monitoring of the civil services and using ICT solutions in a way that has been proved to be more or less effective. So there is space for engagement, and And I think this is something that we can all agree should be reinforced as part of the moving forward agenda of the donor engagement with media.
What was the name of that
The
facility?
Global Partnership for Social Accountability has been
Right.
established in 2012, and it's a pool of funding, so it's a trust fund that the bank manages with funding from different donors, including USAID. And it's a new channel through which bank, for the first time, can give direct funding to non-state actors.
It'd be great to see more media support coming out of that fund. That'd be terrific. Great. We'll take one more round of questions. I had one really quick comment in response to this gentleman from the USAID. I didn't mean to diminish the role of business models. And in fact, on the contrary, we're very interested in SEMA at finding those business models. What I would say is that the landscape is really uneven. There's profitability in some countries and not in others. And even within a single market, there may be broadcast might be very profitable and newspapers might be in serious trouble. And actually understanding that unevenness is really what's critical for media development to be effective. And to give two examples, nonprofits may, if they can see that that newspapers need their money more than anything, these kinds of nonprofits such as Bill and Melinda Gates that are supporting journalism directly, they could be of greater assistance there. But likewise, in the broader context of citizen engagement, I think if these kinds of broader governance partners understand that media ecosystem and see that the investigative journalism, which formerly used to come out of newspapers, is shriveling, that they may have to take up the slack in environments where that's simply not profitable. And in areas where it is profitable, great, let's get private investment in there to shore up that work, but that's not always going to be the case, and especially in digitizing markets. Anyways, we're really involved in that kind of work, and we think it's really a piece of this puzzle that it fits actually into this larger puzzle. Quick round of questions. This gentleman had his hand up. Mark, any others? And then and one more. And also one thing, we have 10 minutes, so keep them very brief. Ivana has to run literally in 10 minutes. If you have any comments also for how to move this forward, any great suggestions for bringing this together, let's hear them. Oh, we have now one in the back. A great suggestion for bringing it together. All right.
Thank you. Will Ferrajaro, consultant to Peace Tech Lab and others. I just had a question. It seems like we're talking about systemic changes in the media sector and responses to that. But we haven't been explicit about the closure of Civic space. And I wondered if you could speak a little more about that direct impact. Obviously, the holistic approaches that some of you are discussing would be one response to that direct and overt action by governments. But I wondered if you could speak a little more explicitly about that.
That's a good question. Mark?
I just wanted to ask a question from, is this working?
Yeah.
Marco and others too, but especially Marco. One of the things that, in fact, Tara and I did some work together back when I was at the World Bank, looking at the way donors behave and the role of the World Bank in governance reforms and in the broader engagement with civil society and these kinds of questions we've been dealing with today, that basically came to the conclusion that the bank's most important role of all is acting as a way of pulling different actors together around a common set of outcomes that might be defined at the country level, and using different players more strategically. And I still think we have a long way to go from that. I think this report lays the groundwork for making the case for doing that. But this report may have less impact on the way the bank behaves than on the way it should, in terms of its own projects, than the way it should behave as a convener of development actors around the world. We've got all these big players like IREX and Internews and USAID and all these other people that are doing the kinds of things that are really necessary for building sustainable media systems. It's woefully underfunded. It's woefully badly integrated into the overall governance agenda of countries. It's badly owned by the countries and the governments that have to deal with these things. And I just wonder if you think this could spur the bank to play a little bit more constructive role in trying to make that happen in around the world.
Great. So on the closing of civil space, do you want to say a word before you maybe have to run off? Yeah.
I just
want to clarify that I'm running off to catch a plane. It's not like I'm eager to leave the stage. Certainly not. I mean, after having this wonderful conversation. Yes, I think I would extend it, closing of civic and media space, and we've certainly seen it in the region that I've been working on, and increasingly so, which is something that I don't think none of us expected. We're back in the role of leveling the playing field, because there was a hope, just like there was a hope for media to become sustainable through advertising and marketing and the business plans years back, like a decade or so ago. There was also hope that civil society is going to be able to continue doing the work that it has been doing without as much international donor support, because it will be the governments that will be stepping in, it will be the private sector that will be stepping in, it will be the citizens that will be stepping in to provide both financial but also other kinds of support. And that has not been the case. And certainly one part of that is economic, because particularly after the 2008 crisis, which I'm going to think of differently now after Naomi's speech, that's been difficult to generate some of those resources, certainly from the private sector and from private citizens. But the governments have certainly shown that they're not quite in the mood to support some of the initiatives that we've outlined here, especially if they have a watchdog role to play. And what we're increasingly seeing now is that I mean, in a term that I think is now known to everybody of democratic backsliding, is that we're going in quite the opposite direction. And unfortunately, I guess we're not going to get out of business as soon as we had hoped. And I mean, speaking of the donor side, and that we're basically back in full force. And this is why it's encouraging, in particular, to see some of this reinvention of approaches in tackling these new challenges, because it is certainly a trend that we're seeing everywhere, even in potential EU member countries, which is the area that I cover.
Great.
Just another short thing about closing space. So we do work in closing spaces, and it's I think partially why we needed this broader model, right? Is so that we can't. If you can't work with a whole media sector, what do? Do you just take a piece of it? So we need to have something more flexible, and that might mean working, again, with the citizens directly. It might mean working with libraries. It might mean but trying to find a way and an entry point towards this end goal of vibrant information, but not necessarily through a media sector approach. So I think that's absolutely right.
Anything?
Yeah, just on the closure of the civic space again. The country I work most on in Bangladesh, and we've had a definite closure there, from really quite vibrant media and civil society space to a really quite controlled one in the last 5 years or so. But it has I think had some quite unexpected effects. I mean, there is some kind of creativity in the space. There are people respond in different ways. Social media has emerged in different ways. Activists find new ways of getting their story out there. So it's interesting to watch. Of course, the long-term prospect is a bit grim, but nevertheless, in the short term, you do see this kind of resistance, which is interesting and fruitful potentially, I think.
Great. Yeah.
So on the say something on the shrinking civic space, because it's something that we give, in fact, we give some sort of empirical evidence in the report, and in this case, we use it's something that's also hard to measure, right? When you speak about shrinking civic space, there's a lot of country-level studies, and then you have to point a single government, so it was also difficult for us to have this kind of conversation and understand whether or not there is a global trend. And we use a data set that has been released, in fact, a couple of years ago, and now they just released the 2016 data, and for those of you who don't know, is a great source of information on media, CSO-related engagements, and basically is the largest source for political scientists. It's the Variety of Democracy project. There's a Variety of Democracy Institute in the University of Gothenburg that we partner with them. We commission some background papers, and they measure. I mean, it's fantastic. Something like 70 million data points. So they cover 177 countries, starting from 1900 up to today. So you can see on indicators such as media censorship by the government, how that measure moved over the past 100 years. And so what you can see, if you look at the global average of like media censorship and CSO, the facility through which CSO can actually enter into the market, register and function, they measure this kind of things. And you can look at the methodology if you're interested. And we show in the report there was a huge trend of like opening space, which of course mirrors the democratization process of the last 40 years. And indeed, globally, you see that the trend is reversing in the past 6-7 years. So there is a shrinking, and it is a global phenomenon. Even if you control by income level, the trend is consistent. So there is some regional effects, but it's also global by large standards. And the point we make is that it's important for us to understand these trends, because they, of course, this kind of operating environment influence the ability of citizens to use this kind of channels that we were referring to before, right? So the ability to use social organizations or political organizations or spaces of public deliberations is a way to effectively engage with the authorities and promote change, depend, of course, on the rules of the games. And the rules of the games are themselves, again, function of this policy arena game. So, again, it's something that we give emphasis in the report, especially for the implication that this might have for citizens to combine these different channels and thereby promote change. On the questions that Mark raised, which are very tough questions, but I think that is again, there's a lot to say about that, and in the role of the bank as producer of knowledge, as an honest broker that can provide evidence and facilitate the debate based on evidence. And the point is that if the institution does not invest in generating new knowledge, the institution will no longer exist on the long term. So in a sense, there is, I suppose, at the highest level, a recognition that influence happen through different channels, and using knowledge and rigorous information can definitely help the dialogue, and this can be one way to engage. So I agreed entirely.
All right. Sounds like the WDR is as much of an internal advocacy tool as it is an external advocacy tool. All right. I think with that we can conclude. Look, this has been really fascinating. I think the real conclusion and takeaway from this is that bringing folks together from governance, media development, civic engagement, democratization generates a fascinating, energizing discussion with lots of possibilities. Now, we didn't quite solve the problem of the international aid architecture, or how to construct projects around, in this holistic manner. But I think it's obvious that if we start moving in this direction, there will be a lot of really exciting possibilities. So we hope others will continue to, encourage this dialogue and this cooperation, and thanks for coming. Thank you. That was great, guys. Yeah. Thanks, Tara. Yeah, good. Yeah, Mike's. Yeah.